Thanks so much for the invitation, and to everyone for sticking around through this exciting but very full day. You made it to the end. So I want to start by introducing myself a little bit more. So my primary research sits right at the intersection of sociolinguistics and psycholinguistics. And much of my work is on how social factors affect speech and language processing, and also the kinds of social processing that we do during the course of using language. But why I am talking with you in this special session of HSP is that throughout my career, I've had several community partnerships with museums. So just a little bit of background on that. This goes back almost 20 years now when I was at the linguistics department at North Carolina State University, where along with Walt Wolfram and others, I led a couple of community-based projects. So for example, in the first picture here, we worked with community members who had been participants in our sociolinguistic fieldwork and worked with them to create a museum exhibit at the Outer Banks History Center that celebrated the Black experience on the Outer Banks. We did a number of other such projects. So then fast forward to when I was on faculty at University of Oregon, I developed a partnership with the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, and I was a science communication fellow there and regularly participated in outreach events, and around 2016 or so, started collecting data at the museum, primarily with kids. And both of these things inform now what I do at University of Maryland, which is to lead the language science station at Planet Word, which I will tell you much more about very soon. But first, I wanted to note that I have a couple motivations for undertaking community partnerships. One of the big ones, though, is that I think talking about our field with public audiences matters. These are just a few of the benefits here, both to the field and to making a more scientifically informed public. But if we think about what's involved in community partnerships at a very basic level, anything involving public engagement and outreach, we have like a body of research on the one hand that we want to communicate with the public. So I want to take a moment to sort of look at the dynamics of research and of public engagement and how they're typically conducted. So research and engagement both involve researchers and members of the public. So with human subjects research, which is what most of us are interested in here, we as researchers are trying to understand what is in the minds of our participants, right? This is what informs the scientific understanding of language. And so in most cases, research tends to be pretty transactional, I would say, and sort of unidirectional. Meanwhile, we might have the very same researcher who is now in a public engagement or outreach setting, right? Public engagement is often sort of unidirectional and in the opposite direction, right? Where we as researchers are trying to convey what is in our minds, what we've learned through our research with members of the public. And we tend to try pretty hard to find those audiences. Surprisingly, they're not just like flocking to hear what we have to say, right? So public engagement and research are typically done in different settings, even though sometimes the same people are involved. While we're doing research, an observation that I want to point out is that it is as if we forget that our research participants are members of the very same public that we often go to great lengths to try to find and connect with in our public engagement work. So this brings me to what I've been calling the research as engagement model. In my recent work with Planet Word, the language science station, I've been aiming to bring research and public engagement closer together, conducted in the same time and at the same place, and crucially to view our research participants as opportunities for engagement and communication about our field. So I'm going to try not to belabor this next analogy too much because I'm not sure how much it holds up, but let me try it out. It's almost like when we're doing research, we're so focused on our research selves, our innies, if you will, that we don't see that there are actual people involved in our research that our engagement selves, our outies, if you will, might want to reach. So this research as engagement model will be a theme throughout my talk, really trying to see participants as opportunities for public engagement, to seek to bring research and engagement in closer contact with one another. And so in many ways, the theme of my talk today will be one of reintegration. Apologies if you haven't yet seen the TV show Severance. Okay, so in my talk, the first part, I will tell you more about my project, the Language Science Station at Planet Word, in various ways, ending with some lessons about what we've learned about doing research and engagement at the museum. And then in the second part, I'll tell you about ways that the museum experience has made me think about research differently, even outside the museum and back in the lab, and some challenges and opportunities that I think that invites for us as researchers. Okay, so for the first part, the Language Science Station, we are a pop-up research and engagement lab that's housed at Planet Word Museum in downtown DC. And what we do is we run language-related research studies that invite Planet Word visitors to be our participants. So we get valuable data from a broad population, and we get to talk with that broad population about language science and our studies and what we're learning. It's funded by a collaborative grant by the National Science Foundation to University of Maryland, Gallaudet University, and Howard University. So a bit about Planet Word, though I hope that most of you will get to experience it for yourselves here very soon tonight. It is a museum devoted to words and language. It opened in the fall of 2020, and it's founder-led. It's also free. It's supported entirely by donors. It's very interactive and experience-based, as you'll see. Some of the galleries have more of an explicit linguistics focus, but more of the galleries are just sort of more generally language-related, so things like about literature, humor, advertising. So the creation of an institution dedicated to language in a high-profile setting like this was an exciting opportunity for those of us who are interested in public engagement. So several of us were involved in the development of the museum, just thinking about like, well, what should even be included in a museum about language? And several of us serve on the advisory board, and all of this influenced my eventual formation of the Language Science Station. So what we've done so far in terms of sort of the high-level numbers here, we launched our first studies in the summer of 2022. We've developed and run 10 different research studies so far from many different subfields across the language sciences with many different research teams. We've trained almost 40 students from all across DC area universities, 7 different universities so far, as research assistants. And together our team has interacted with over 6,400 visitors from all ages and lots of different backgrounds and counting. So I don't expect you to be able to see everybody's name here, but I did want to put folks involved in the project here up on the slide just to show that this is truly a team effort. So you'll see people from lots of different institutions here, and I want to just mention a little bit about the structure. So we have a director, which is me. We've had 3 fantastic lab managers so far who have been postbacks. The LSS sort of really serves as a sort of research hub or a collective to a whole bunch of different research teams. And these are typically faculty and PhD students who are responsible for designing the studies sort of in close consultation with me and the other LSS team members. We also have our student RAs, as I mentioned, typically undergrads and master's students, and they're the ones who are really the face of the Language Science Station at the museum. They are the ones running the studies and interacting with visitors. And we've also had a really great sort of tiered mentorship program. So the guiding principle of the Language Science Station is that we prioritize the experience that museum visitors have interacting with us more than we value the data that we collect from them. The data are really important to us, of course, but we place a really high value on participants' experience, and this guides a lot of how we operate. So we want participants to learn something from their participation, but we don't really care if what they learn is linguistic facts. Of course, they can and they do learn specific things about language, but we would also consider it to be a really great interaction if someone just walked away thinking like, I didn't know there were people who studied that, or like, I want to learn more about that. So we're mostly interested in things that you see on one side of the screen that are more about having a fun experience, having a positive, kind of walking away with like a positive feeling about linguistics. So along with each of our studies, we design educational activities in the form of extended debriefing conversations. So debriefings are things that, of course, also happen in the lab and in online studies, but as someone who's also been running lab-based studies for many years, I know that these can often be fairly formulaic, kind of an afterthought, but we really treat the experimental debriefing as a critical opportunity for doing science communication. They're true, in our formulation, they're true conversations between a student RA and the museum visitor participant, And we use best practices in science communication and informal science learning to design these, but by design they're also allow for visitors to kind of lead the conversation in terms of what they were interested in. So we recognize that we are being ambassadors of our field to the public when we're at the museum, right? We know that for many people, their interaction with us may be their first and potentially only interaction with the field, so we want to make it count. Doing what we do is new to practically everybody involved. Students and research teams, we're all really figuring this out as we go. So a big part of my role as PI of the project has been doing a lot of training. So working with researchers on figuring out what are going to be the right ways to design studies for the museum environment, and working with students on the research and the science communication skills that are necessary for running these studies, since they are the ones who are interacting with visitors. And so far, our student training has been in the form of a summer course. So I won't have a chance to go into all of our studies. I wish I had more time. They have spanned many different methodologies and subfields of the language sciences. So a couple examples, we've had several studies on sentence processing, some of which have been presented at HSP before. We have a study using FNIRS, where participants get to see their brains in action on the museum floor. We've had 2 studies on American Sign Language, one of which I hope you got to experience during the demo sessions at the poster sessions so far. And we have a study about memory, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a moment, since that one is my study. So thinking about designing and workshopping and piloting the studies, we are always thinking about participants' experiences and also just how the study is going to work in the museum. We use a really iterative process that involves a lot more collaboration than typical studies that are done in a lab culture, where the research teams get regular feedback from the broader LSS group, and we do a lot of refining based on our piloting with museum visitors. So that gives us a ton of information about how the study is going. So this doesn't mean that we shortcut the science. We're dedicated to doing rigorous experimental work, but we use visitors' experience as sort of a heuristic when we're making different decisions about the design of a study. So this can involve some creativity on the part of researchers, especially when we think about how to use the museum as an asset instead of a liability. So I want to give you a glimpse of that from my own study, Word Island, just as a kind of a case study on the design. It is by no means like the best example of this. I just happen to know more about it since it's my study. So I knew that for my study, I wanted to follow up on some work that I've done in the past on memory for spoken words, in particular recognition memory. So I have a couple of previous studies with Megan Sumner at Stanford and her fantastic grad student, Will Clapp. I'm not going to go into the science at all here, except to say that the basic idea in those series of studies is that we've found some really interesting memory asymmetries. So recognition memory has differed across voices, both across and within macrosocial demographic categories. So I wanted to just look at this general idea that not all voices are encoded equally, but I wanted to approach it from an entirely different angle at the museum. So it was kind of starting from this general topic, I then was thinking about, okay, well, what are the constraints and also the assets of the museum? So we know the study must be very short and suitable for all ages. The JML study that I mentioned had about 328 trials, not suitable, not fun. And more generally, I wanted to give myself the challenge to not simply recreate the lab in the museum. Right, so the museum has a certain number of affordances that we ought to take advantage of, right? So I didn't want to just play people recordings of speakers because they could do that at home or do that in the lab. I wanted to actually have people talk and listen to one another. I also wanted to take advantage of the fact that visitors tend to come in the museum in groups. And in fact, for many of our other studies, we really have to convince them, like, please, will you do this separately? People really want to, interact with the people that they came with. So I wanted to use that strategically. So after trying a whole bunch of different things, what we sort of landed on was this idea. So groups of 4 to 6 participate together, and they are told that they are competing in a team-based adventure-themed reality show. And they're told that they and their team are going to be dropped on a deserted island for a year, where they're going to live and work together. And their job now is to take turns naming aloud a list of items that their team needs to bring to the island. So they have to go around and say, our team needs to bring matches. And you hear a lot of kids saying, our team needs to bring an Xbox, and these sorts of things. So this is effectively the study phase of the memory study. This is a pretty fun experience for participants. Then they take a surprise free recall test and a source memory test. And the key factor that we're looking at here is talker familiarity, because some members of the group know one another and some of them don't. So we have a mix of all kinds of different groups where it's like, 4 family members participating and 2 strangers and all possible combinations. And this is something that, to my knowledge, hasn't yet been investigated in the literature, and a setting like a museum is a really nice way to be able to look at this. We're also able to replicate or try to replicate known effects in this new setting, things like the generation effect in this sort of more multi-party context. So we are still running participants. We've run over 150 groups so far. We are still coding the data. So stay tuned for the actual results, hopefully at a future HSP. But I just wanted to illustrate an example of what it looks like to kind of try to design a study with the realities of the museum sort of featured in the design instead of sort of kind of working against them. I wanted to mention here that, so from my experience working with a whole bunch of different groups to create studies for the museum, I've put together a whole bunch of resources. These are things that we're using internally to onboard new teams to the Language Science Station, guidelines and worksheets, but I think they're more generally applicable. I'll put this QR code and the link again up at the end of the talk. But this is also all works in progress. We're still adding to things as we learn, so if you use them and find them useful or have suggestions, please let me know. Okay, so to kind of start closing up the first part here, some benefits. It is a lot of work to do what we do, but we do see lots of benefits to it. Some are benefits to the field, others for the public, for individual researchers, and for our students. But I wanted to pause on this last bullet point here, given the topic of the special session, which is about the community partners. So in our case, Planet Word. It's been very important for us to, as researchers, to really understand the motivations of the community partner and vice versa. It's really nice to be able to understand, like, well, what counts as a win for you? Why do you want to keep doing this? And so in our case, I knew even before the opening of the museum that the museum's founder, Anne Friedman, really wanted Planet Word to become known not just as a site of knowledge dissemination, but also as a site of knowledge creation. And we are what enables them to do that. And so that's been valuable for them, and it's been helpful for us to understand. Okay, so from benefits to challenges, of course, with a complex project like this, there are many challenges. I'm just going to name 2 right now. The presence of multiple universities has actually been one of the biggest benefits of this project, especially to students. The students really love meeting their counterparts at other institutions, and especially Gallaudet students, we're getting just so much more exposure and interest in sign language across all of our students. But it also presents some of the most annoying logistical hurdles. So thinking about registering students from 7 universities into a single course and getting them all on payroll, IRBs, you can imagine, it's a huge amount of work, but it's also been a hugely important part of the project. Sustainability is a big one, right? So we could not do this project without funding. There are a lot of moving parts, a lot of things that cost money, and as you can imagine, our future is very uncertain at this current moment in time, and so that is an ongoing challenge, of course. Okay, so to close this first part, I wanted to talk about kind of what we've learned about doing public-facing research through this project. And I want to start by saying what I thought we would learn. What I thought we would learn is mostly some things about doing some methodological shifts or tips and tricks or guidelines. So things like, yeah, probably do more between subjects designs, or like, here are some ways that you can make your stimuli even more child-friendly. And we have learned a lot of those things. We have learned a lot about that, for sure. But what we learned that I think is a little bit more surprising is that doing this work also requires not only methodological shifts, but mindset shifts into the way that the research is done. So all of us who are used to working in lab settings, we have our process, we have the way things go, but Our studies are designed in a very collaborative way with iteration and feedback, especially from participants and crucially from the RAs, who are sort of the voice of the participants, who are able to say, participants kind of keep getting bored at this part or losing interest, or participants kind of walk away thinking that the study is about this when it really is actually about this other thing. And so in the culture of the lab, that can be kind of inconvenient to have to contend with. Like, we're used to saying, well, if the data are fine, my job is done. But it's made the process much better for everyone if we commit to, in the very beginning, to making refinements on our studies based on how the experience of the study is for our participants and what they get out of it. So that's been a big shift that we've all kind of had to contend with, and I think it's really been for the better. So that mindset shift does come with big payoffs as we're working to bring research and engagement in closer conversation and being able to do public engagement with our participants through the research process itself. Okay, so on to the second part here, from the museum to the lab. So I could have ended the talk after the first part, and I could have congratulated myself that we're doing research and we're doing engagement at the museum, and it's really great, and that my process of reintegration has been complete. But here's the issue, which actually took me kind of an embarrassingly long time to see, and where I will briefly revisit the severance characters again. So even though I've been running studies in museums since 2016 or so, I've also been conducting research in the lab and online during that time as well. And for a long time, these two parts of my research life did not interact. So the way that I ran my non-museum studies didn't change much, because honestly, I didn't think about it too much. It's almost like just within my research self, I had yet another severance between these two different ways of doing research, right? So I had my museum self that was really thinking hard about participants' experiences and what to do and all of these things, how to make research more fun and exciting. And I was sort of just doing business as usual back in the lab. But over time and in the past few years, I really haven't been able to keep them separate. So my museum self has started to rub off on my lab self, but I do promise I'm not like Helena. Okay, so I now want to briefly tell you about a project where I've been trying to kind of more carefully get at this. Okay, experiments communicate things to our participants, and this is true whether we're aware of it or not. This is something that I was not able to ignore after hours and hours of working with participants on the museum floor and seeing that they come away from participating in our studies with a particular idea of who we are, what we're interested in, what our field is all about. And sometimes they walk away with something we want them to, and sometimes they might not. And so this is always happening. I just happen to be more aware of it because of how much I was interacting with participants. So I think that this is true in the same way that listeners generate implicatures during conversations, right? Participants are generating inferences during experiments about our field, what we care about, how we see ourselves in relation to language, all kinds of things. So I have a newer NSF grant that's looking into some of these big questions. So my collaborator is Abby Walker, who's at Virginia Tech. We're doing a lot of fun things with the grant, but I'm going to tell you about one of the very first things we did that we're writing up right now. So we're looking at what participants infer about our research and about our field from our studies, and then what the experience of participating in our studies is like for participants. So basically, we're wondering, when participants do linguistic experiments, what did they walk away thinking that linguistics is about? And Abby and I, being who we are, we're especially interested in experimental tasks that are done in sociolinguistics. So for example, we're thinking about tasks like these speaker perception tasks, where you have some research question or another where you need to know, you ask participants to listen to speech and to rate it on some social dimensions. So maybe like friendliness or intelligence or accentedness and things like this. So this is a very commonly done task in sociolinguistics, but now I want us to think about kind of how this actually works out. So Abby, my co-author, is a great illustrator, and I'm going to use some illustrations that she made for our project. So let's imagine that we have a researcher who now is in their public engagement self, and they are saying, going out and talking to someone and saying like, hey, we don't think it's a good idea to judge people's speech, right? And so now you have this member of the public who's like, cool, okay, got it. Linguists don't want me to judge speech, got it. Okay, so now imagine this same person in the context of being asked to do a speaker perception study, where basically we are saying, please judge the speech, right? So from this, they could completely sensibly generate this inference that linguists think that we can and should judge people's speech. So by asking them to do this, we're wondering that if we are effectively licensing the inference that we think that A, this is a possible task, and B, that it's a reasonable one, right? Okay, so they might end up feeling like that. So we decided to start by just talking to participants. Very first step. So we did 1-hour Zoom sessions on Prolific, and we just asked people to think aloud as they did some common sort of mini versions of experimental tasks. Again, for us, we were interested in tasks where people are listening to audio stimuli and that are more done in sociolinguistics. We asked them to think aloud as they did them, but also to kind of share their responses about how did it make them feel to be asked to do these tasks, and also critically for today, why they thought the researchers were interested in doing this study. Like, what did they think we planned to do with the data? And so there's a potpourri of different tasks here. We just wanted to get a glimpse into kind of what participants might think about these different tasks, but there's a big caveat here that like this is not like a normal experiment. You wouldn't be doing all of these tasks in a row, and we do recognize that. There's a lot more to these conversations that I won't get a chance to talk about. We asked about their trust in science after being on Prolific. It was a really fun series of conversations. Today I'm just going to be talking about the speaker perception task and the grammaticality judgment task. So the speaker perception task was exactly as I showed before. They listened to 5 samples from speakers of a lot of different accent backgrounds. And then the grammaticality judgment task, we wanted to do a task that is not explicitly social. I would argue that all language tasks are social in some way, but we chose the sentences to elicit a range of responses from sort of grammatical to ungrammatical to more variation, but we also included ones that were grammatical in certain but not all varieties of English. There were 8 trials here. I want to put big caveats again here that we know that this does not resemble the conditions for most grammaticality or acceptability judgment tasks. It was after a whole bunch of other tasks. It's auditory, it contains this mix of stimuli, but the conclusions that I want to draw from this are much more general. Okay, so I want to point out that the goal of both of these tasks is fundamentally descriptive, right? Just as our orientation as linguists is descriptive, for both tasks, we have some research questions where we just need to find out how participants rate stimuli. We did a qualitative analysis, although admittedly qualitative research is newer to both Abby and me, but you'll have to take my word for it right now that the themes that I mentioned here are representative of the data. Okay, so we wanted to ask sort of why did participants think researchers would do these tasks? What did they think? We saw that some inferred descriptive goals and some inferred prescriptive goals. So in interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So just to show that for descriptive goals, yep, it was kind of unsurprising. A lot of the participants really kind of nicely tracked with what we are doing, just sort of saying, yep, I think you want to know what I think about these accents, or what people are willing to accept as grammatical. The others that inferred prescriptive goals, for things like the speaker perception task, it was things like you're going to use this for advertising or for creating AI voices that have certain attributes, things like market research that serve a more norm entrenching function. For grammaticality judgment, participants often would equate the task with a sort of grammar test, right? Like you're trying to test me on what I know about grammar. And so some participants were clearly wrestling with this. They were feeling like the goals were probably descriptive, but nonetheless they felt like they were being scrutinized. So I want to play you this response from a participant who's responding to a question about whether they felt like there were right or wrong answers in this task.
I guess in this one, yes, because it's trying to see, do you know what grammatically correct sentences sound like? That's what I felt. Uh, but no, I know that realistically that researchers are just looking for your thoughts. They're not trying to grade you or, but that's automatically how I feel
Sure.
sometimes when it comes to tasks like these.
Okay. So responses like these signal how participants are negotiating around who has authority in language and who they think we as the researchers think has authority in language, right? So of course, we as language scientists, we study language, we are authorities in that sense, but our fundamental orientation is descriptive, right? We think that the authority rests with the language users. That's why we think language is cool. But as we know, most people's formal interactions with language in their lifetimes tend to be prescriptive, English classes, standardized tests, things like this. So we think these responses call to mind like early stages of the language subordination process that Lippy Green talks about as part of standard language ideology, where language is mystified and authority is claimed. So without more context or more debriefing, being asked to do what looks to them like a grammar test might be reinforcing that there are authorities on proper grammar and that we, the linguistic researchers, are positioning ourselves as those authorities. And this is unfortunate, right? Because with the grammaticality judgment task, we're effectively saying, like, you are the authority. We want to know what you think about these sentences, but this is not always coming across to participants. Okay, so to start to wrap up here, our experiments are sending messages, right? When we ask participants about them, we find that some participants might be walking away with an understanding of our field that's at odds with our goals. But before you say like, oh, well, I don't work in audio stimuli, so this doesn't apply to me, or I don't really work on social things, so this isn't an issue, my bigger message here is really that I think we could all think more about how participants will interpret our studies because they will interpret it somehow. So the act of participating in an experiment is not without consequences for the individual. We can't opt out of this, right? Our experiments are sending messages, so all we can do is choose to be more intentional about what we're communicating. And I want us to think about how we can mitigate misguided assumptions through context and debriefing. Can we make experiments a site of active positive engagement about our field? I do think debriefings can be an important tool here. Abby and I are starting to look at this empirically, but I think there are things we can do without too much work to make them more effective. But in general, I think just thinking about what you want participants to leave with, both in terms of what they learn and how they feel. I don't want to oversell this because I know that we all know that even after like an entire semester of intro to linguistics, and maybe not everyone is kind of getting it, but I do think every little bit counts. And I think that this is especially true in the current climate when we need all the support for science we can get. So I think about there being a reservoir of goodwill toward our field and towards science more generally. And every time we run a research study with human subjects, we can choose to draw down that reservoir or we can choose to replenish it. So I just want to close by kind of issuing a challenge to all of us by thinking about how we can kind of replenish this reservoir of goodwill toward our field and towards science through what and how we communicate with our participants. So if we just think about everyone in this room who, conservatively, we're doing a couple studies a year, and each of those studies has conservatively a couple dozen or a couple hundred participants, just the impact that we could have really ripples out, I think. So to end by connecting back to the slide I had at the beginning of the talk, community partnerships are important. I will continue to seek them out and build them and grow them, especially with museums. But I also think it's important to think about who public audiences are. You don't need a big fancy community partnership to accomplish a lot of these goals, right? If we do human subjects research, we already have connections with and pipelines to public audiences. So I'll close with an invitation to consider all human subjects experiments as occasions to do intentional public engagement with research participants, and thank you.
Asked so many questions. Okay, walk fast, talk fast. This is wonderful. I've been thinking a lot about some similar ideas, so I clearly should pick your brain about it. So two comment and then a question. So I'm also running some museum studies. My main research interest is like how do people understand speech errors or learn new words, things where there isn't a clear answer, and I always tell them there's no right answers in this study, and 50% of them say, how did I do?
So only 50%? I feel like it's usually like
so
many,
we have the station decorated with coloring sheets for children that say, language varies, all language is beautiful, things like that. That might help. I don't know if it does. Yeah, maybe it's a conservative estimate. So yeah, so I mean, there's this like, oh my God, how do we push back against this? So I like really am feeling that as well. The other thing that I've been struggling with is I have a grad student who's coming from a more sociocultural background and is really interested in participatory research framework. How do we do that in a museum setting when you lose the person, right? So are we talking about community? So participatory research is where the community members are involved throughout, but it's often the same people. It's not the one person and then another person. So how can we do that better? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So you're thinking about doing almost like citizen science type
Sort of.
participatory
I mean,
research?
we tried that, and
Yeah.
no one has. It's not. Yeah.
Yeah, so I know there have been various efforts to do kind of more of the citizen science type, and I do think that, yeah, we are involving participants in our research, but at a very, or like more members of the public and community members at a much later stage of the process, right? There's a lot of times where we might want to have community members more invested from the very beginning. I don't have great answers for that, except that I think it's important, and I think a lot of the way that I sort of came up was through Walt Wolfram's model at NC State, where we were doing a lot of, like we had been in a fieldwork site for years, and so we would work with the community members to understand like what they needed, and sometimes it was about language, and honestly sometimes it wasn't, and so we really kind of considered it sort of a part of our responsibility for working with those researchers to do what was best for that community. And so sometimes I feel like the answer might not look like the way we want it to, and that's okay, right?
Well, unfortunately, when you are in Santa Barbara, California, the answer to that question of what do you want to see studied is not very interesting. What does your community need when your community is 70-year-old retirees as grandchildren, what white, wealthy retirees as grandchildren. So I don't know. I mean, like, I think it's really cool.
Yeah, and sometimes in those cases, it might be giving them a little bit about what they don't know that they need, right?
Yeah,
So,
right, word.
Thanks. Zach.
Thanks for all this. I'm thinking about the step you're talking about bringing your lab-based research to be more engaged in the kind of model you've developed at Planet Word.
Yeah.
And the immediate thing I come up against is how often in lab-based studies you have a student who's coming in to knock out their credits, attempt to engage in a conversation about, and they're like, listen, I want to leave here. Yeah. So I'm wondering how you think about that. That's just maybe a sort of a design problem for us in thinking about this, and I'm wondering how you'd think about taking these principles when it's not people who've come to a space to learn.
Yes, great question. I will not claim to be an expert or that I have any real answers about this, except that it is an issue, and I think that's why I said, like, I don't want to oversell this, because, and even at the museum, this is something we stress with our RAs a lot, where it's like not every conversation is going to be a home run. Sometimes participants are going to walk away and, you know, like, oh, there's another shiny thing I want to go play with at the museum. And same thing with undergrads in our research studies, that like sometimes, you know, are falling asleep or hungover, all these things. Abby and I have been playing around with different things. So I think the last thing that we want to do is to create yet another thing that we as researchers have to do. Like we have so much to try to get, you know. So what we're trying to play around with are just like what are some, both in terms of the form and the content of debriefings in particular, like what little tweaks can we make that might have more of an impact? And I think also kind of getting away from the idea that the only thing that counts as impact is for them to like know everything there is to know about our field, or to even really know. I think a lot of times we feel like, well, the only thing I'm allowed to talk about is this small, tiny incremental hypothesis that this individual study is building on. And so one of the big things has been to reframe and take a big step back and just like communicate something to them about your entire subfield and what you're all about, right? So not being afraid to sort of give like a little mini intro lecture or something, like not lecture, but like to kind of frame it in terms of, if you had this is the only time that this person ever encounters linguistics, what do you want them to walk away with, instead of like, well, we were building on this study that we did this, what, you know. So like kind of reframing that. We are actively working on this. There have been some, well, I won't get into that for other questions, but I'm happy to talk about this more. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Zach.
Hi, Steve Politzer from University of Kansas. Thank you. That was a wonderful message, and it really challenges me to change what I've been doing. Maybe piggybacking off a little bit from the last question, I imagine that what you're doing at Language Science Center must also be a really good tool for like getting people to come into the lab for those studies that can't be short and fun, right? Because you can be like, hey, if you liked Word Island, like you can come back in the weekend to do the 3-hour version with with a sticky EEG cap on your head. Like, do you have you gathered any data that speaks to how successful you've been at getting members of the public to come back for more?
So we actually haven't been making that, it's a great question. We haven't been having that as our first priority. And I know a lot of like developmental labs, this is the whole model, right? It's like you do outreach because you want to get people to come into the lab. I want to see, I don't know if Gavkar's still here. She was around yesterday. But we've had one study, our FNIR study that they had actually first done with preschoolers. They have been doing some more advertising for other studies there, but actually we, to start, really haven't been doing a lot of that, just to sort of, I don't know, just to kind of keep things separate for now, but I do think that it would be a great tool. I think Planet Word is a little bit of a special case, maybe not a special case, but it's in DC, so we do get some local visitors, but a huge number of the visitors we get are from international or whatever, so they're not around to come back. But it could hopefully be a tool, although I'd hate to have them come in and be sorely disappointed about, you know, the 3-hour version, but yeah, great idea.
Hi, Jack Dempsey, University of Illinois in Cascade Reading. First, thank you for the talk. I'm excited to go to the museum tonight. This kind of touches on what Laurel was saying with the participants. I mean, we've all experienced a participant asking, how did I do, right? And I was wondering if you've ever actually just used the results from participants immediately in any of these studies, especially since you're all about engaging them and teaching them about the science, like maybe teaching them exactly what they got wrong, like, haha, you got garden path 10 times. Like maybe that would be, you know, enlightening for them. Have you done anything like that?
Yeah, so we have found that actually one of the things that builds the best interactions with people afterwards is because the research assistant is right there next to the participant when they're doing the study. And so actually we had a previous study that Colin Phillips' group and co-led on this sort of role reversals as in the previous talk. And it's really fun to hear people say, you know, the girl stung the bee and those kinds of things. So to be able to use that as sort of a launching point, so there's a balance between not wanting to make people feel bad, but also to have it be like, oh, I noticed that you kind of laughed when you did that, like, and using that to kind of launch. I mean, I just want to note that, like, it's rare that we get to form such cool common ground, right? Like, this is why it's another amazing experience to do public engagement in a research setting, because you've just had people thinking about language, and like you can use that as a way to kind of build interest. I think one other thing that we've done is we had a study, the Guess the Sign study that Deanna Gagné and her group did. It was pulled from a corpus of like hundreds and hundreds of signs, and people were guessing the sign, right? And they always wanted to know how well they did. And there was no way to program the feedback in real time. So we kept getting this, So what we did is we put a couple trials at the end that were the same for everybody where they did get feedback. So there was like a little bit of a mix of both, right?
Cool, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, I think we have to stop now. We're going to stay on schedule, so please join me in thanking our speakers.